So we're starting something new. This is a Maamar in Likutei Torah as Shabsoisai Tismoiru, Parshas Behar. As you can see, it's a hefty Maamar. It's considerably long. And as I've done lately, I divided up my Maamar into sections. All of this work is my own, except for where it says Biur Hadvarim al Pasuk as Shabsoisai on line 496, which appears in the original. And instead of dividing the Maamar up into classes, class 1, class 2, I gave koisrais, I gave headings to describe the substance of each section of the Maamar. I tried to divide the Maamar up into reasonably sized pieces, but you have to deal with the Maamar. Sometimes the Rabbi talks about an idea for 40 lines, sometimes the Rabbi talks about an idea for 4 lines, and you have to adapt accordingly. So this is our next Likutei Torah project. We've been focusing a lot on the Maamar of the Rebbe, and we, Baruch Hashem, completed the Hemshech of Maamarim from Tafshin Tesvav, which has taken us a while. I think it was 20 classes. So we're back to Likutei Torah. Don't misunderstand. We're going to be doing the Rebbe's Maamarim alongside this, as we have until now. Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach, but this is a new project. It's Shabsoisai Tismoiru. Of course, as always, I want to begin this series of classes with an introduction. There is a film that was recently publicized about a Yid whose name I don't remember, a Chassidishe Yid, an old Chassidic Jew from Williamsburg, I'm going to assume, who came to the Rebbe. And he talks and talks and talks and talks. He really just carries on. And the Rebbe listens and listens and listens. It's very interesting. I've seen people comment, a man argues with the Rebbe. That's how this little piece of film is categorized. I disagree vehemently. What I see is a man talking to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe is delighting, literally delighting. The Rebbe is enjoying every word, because this person is clearly passionate and perhaps a little bit of a character, but unbelievably genuine and unbelievably sincere. And you can sense in how the Rebbe listens to him. The Rebbe is pashat enjoying a Yid who cares so much metanemes. And he talks about a number of points. He talks about Shleimus Haaretz. He talks about all kinds of issues. And one of the issues he talks about is the idea of keeping Shabbos. And that if all Yidden would keep Shabbos, Mashiach would come. It's a Gemara. And he tells the Rebbe that he needs the Rebbe to schreiben for him a nisach, that the Rebbe should write for him a nusach, and the Rebbe should also tell him which Rabbanim he should consult to see to it that this undertaking should happen. And of course, as you know, in more recent times, there's an initiative that originated really in South Africa, from the chief rabbi of South Africa, to have Shabbos across the world, Shabbos across America, based on this Maamar Chazal. And this person was by the Rebbe 26, 27 years ago, proposing the idea. I don't know because I didn't study this, but I suspect that was before Shabbos across America became in vogue, became popular. And he's koching and he's talking so emotionally to the Rebbe about the idea of all Yidden keeping one Shabbos. And he tells the Rebbe these 2 points, that he needs the Rebbe to tell him which rabbis to talk to. And he also needs the Rebbe's Ashram Harem HaNisach. The Rebbe should write the text to market the idea. So regarding the question of which Rabbanim you should consult, the Rebbe says, I can't tell you which Rabbanim to consult, because you should consult every Rav. It's not 1 or 2 or many. Every single person, in the Rebbe's words, that cares about the Gemara, that says that Emolei Shamru Yisrael Shtei Shabbos, Mashiach would come, should be consulted. But as far as the Nusach is concerned, the Rebbe asks him, how do you know that your Nusach was not accepted? So he tells the Rebbe, I sent out 500 letters, I didn't get any responses. So the Rebbe says to him, they don't have to respond to you, they have to respond to the Eibishter. You proposed an idea. The idea is a good one, because it's not your idea, it's a Talmudic idea, it's written in the Gemara. They don't have to come back to you and tell you what they've done with it, they have to just do something with it b'poel. And the Rebbe says, you don't know whether your words have been effective or have not been effective, and so on. And as I mentioned, today there is such an initiative. I think they do it every year. And then the Rebbe tells them, you don't need me to write a nusach. The nusach has already been written. It's written in the Gemara. Just quote the Gemara. And the Rabbi says to him, you don't need to have to write a new text or a new nusach. Simply quote where the Gemara discusses the idea of keeping Shabbos, bringing Mashiach, and it's enough of a nusach. And like I said, I watched this video, like many others did, and I felt that the Rebbe was literally getting pleasure, Pasha getting pleasure, from a Yid was meint es hazeh mit haneves, who means it so sincerely. That's my read. Now you can go watch it and say that I'm reading it wrong, which is fine. So this is a story about a Yid who had an initiative to make Shabbos across the world, Shabbos across America, based on this Gemara that Mashiach would come. Our Maamar is on this Gemara. Our Maamar is on this Gemara, as you'll see soon. I'm not ready to get there yet, but our Maamar is on this Gemara. But I want to say something else. And what I'm about to say is a bit controversial. And again, you don't have to agree with me. It's just a thought that I want you to hear as I introduce this Maamar to you. I used to give a shir in Tanya in Flatbush, and a Yid, a Barurian, a Talmud Chacham actually, who came to my shir for a while, he would ask me various questions about the Rebbe and about Lubavitch. So one of the questions he asked me was, why doesn't the Rebbe make a Miftzah Shabbos? The Rebbe made a Miftzah Tefillin, the Rebbe made a Miftzah Taras HaMishpacha, the Rebbe made a Miftzah Kashrus. Why didn't the Rebbe make a campaign for Shmiras Shabbos? I answered him spontaneously. I answered him on the spot. In other words, I didn't think it through. And I've had time to think it through now. It's happened many years ago. And I'm going to tell you what I said to him. And I think that what I'm about to say is true, although I cannot know with certainty, and I certainly don't want to speak on the Rebbe's behalf. What I said to him is the Rebbe made a Miftzah Shabbos to be the same thing as making a Miftzah being Frum, Miftzah Frumkeit. Miftzah Shmiras Kol HaMitzvahs. Because Shabbos is Yidishkeit. A person who keeps Shabbos is a Frum Yid. A person who doesn't keep Shabbos is really not a Frum Yid. This is true in Halacha, because a person who's Mechal Shabbos is a Mumah L'Chol HaTorah Kula. It's also true factually and culturally. Shabbos, for some reason, defines you as a religious Jew to yourself, which is, of course, the most important thing. And when the Rebbe made the Miftzayim, the Rebbe didn't make the Miftzayim that from a Yidden should put on film. The Rebbe didn't make Miftzayim that from a Yid should put up on mezuzah. The whole concept of Miftzayim is that a Yid who, for whatever reasons, may not be keeping all the Tayag mitzvahs should keep at least one, or two, or three. And of course, the Rebbe used to always quote the Tanya, Perikov Ches, chapter 28, that a person should not feel like a hypocrite, where he does one mitzvah, like for example, he lights Shabbos candles, and he may not do another mitzvah. He keeps kosher, or keeps Taras HaMishpacha. Rabbi Tendler was interviewed also, and he said that when the Rebbe made Mitzvah Taras HaMishpacha, he told the Rebbe that he didn't think that it would be received by secular people in the world of today. And he says the Rebbe was so correct that you see so many people who are not from in any other way, and Taras HaMishpacha talks to them. And the Rebbe wanted to give a Yid an opportunity to do at least one mitzvah, or two mitzvahs, or three mitzvahs. And it's based, as the Rebbe always said, on the principle of Yahavta l'reacha kamoicha, that just like if a person were ill or were hungry, you would give them medicine, you would give them food, you would give them clothing, you would give them shelter. When a person is spiritually hungry and cold and sick and afraid, even if they don't think they're hungry, sick, cold, and afraid, which only makes their illness all the more severe, out of love you have to help them. And if you can't give them everything, give them something. And this is the concept of the Miftzayim. A Yid does one mitzvah. And of course, in addition to that initial idea of Ahavas Yisrael, there is also the idea of mitzvah geredes mitzvah. You start with one mitzvah and then it leads to a second mitzvah. As the Rebbe actually told stories over and over again about Neshek, that people would start lighting Shabbos candles on Friday night, and then they wouldn't watch television when the candles were burning, and then they started making Kiddush, and one thing led to another, and they ended up keeping Shabbos. The whole concept of Miftzayim is that he does even one mitzvah, and it connects him to the Eibishter, it separates him from the nations of the world, and it sets the stage for many good things that may come later. The Rebbe didn't make a Mitzvah Shabbos because Mitzvah Shabbos is the Eibishter's mitzvah, to be frum. Now again, I don't know if what I just said is accurate and true, and I certainly don't want to speak on behalf of the Rebbe, but there's a point to be made. And the point is, Shabbos is Yidishkeit, period. And you see it in the positive and you see it in the negative. You know, if you know the history of Jews in America, which starts approximately 140 years ago, 135 years ago, you know that America was a land of opportunity and a land of freedom, and relatively speaking, it was a land that embraced the Jewish people. There was anti-Semitism in America, but it cannot be compared to the anti-Semitism overseas. But the one thing that America did not provide opportunity for was keeping Shabbos, because in America you had to work 6 days. And the American work ethic and the American lack of labor laws made it impossible for an immigrant to keep Shabbos and literally to put food on the table, to give his family bread and water. They would have starved. There was no safety net. There was no great, what did he call Roosevelt? The great society. What did Roosevelt call it? The New Deal. None of those ideas existed. If he didn't feed himself, he starved. And we lost millions and millions of Jews were lost. And all of these Jews who were lost were going to shul and learning Torah and keeping kosher. They were not keeping Shabbos. And their children are gone forever. Now, it's complicated because it wasn't only because the parents didn't keep Shabbos that the children were gone. There was a huge culture of melting, of assimilating into American culture. But by and large, it's a fact that those who kept Shabbos kept their children. And those who did not keep Shabbos did not keep their children, because Shabbos has an incredible impact on what a Yid is. And maybe it isn't logical, maybe it's spiritual, maybe it's transcendent, maybe it's esoteric. But Shabbos, a person who keeps Shabbos is frum. If you keep Shabbos, you will keep kosher. You will wear tefillin. You will keep Taras HaMishpacha. You will, sooner or later. Because Shabbos just is, that's what a Yid is. A Yid keeps Shabbos. Now, if you needed to compare it to something else, I would compare it to Bris Milah. Bris Milah also is one of those things. Bris Milah is different than Shabbos in the sense that so many Yidden abandoned Shabbos, but they did not abandon Bris Milah. Yidden kept Bris Milah even in Russia, even in Soviet Russia, with Mesiras Nefesh Gadol. But some things in Yiddishkeit just go to the very essence of a person, and there's no question that Shabbos is one of those. So the Rebbe didn't make mitzvah Shabbos not because he didn't think Shabbos was so important, but faket, because the point was Shabbos. The point was that you start with one mitzvah, and then mitzvah, gereres mitzvah, one brings to a second mitzvah, and a third mitzvah, and a fourth mitzvah, until you're a Yid who a Yid is supposed to be. And what is a Yid? A Yid is a Shemesh Shabbos. He keeps Shabbos. For 26 hours he does no work. For 26 hours, he's in a world of holiness. 26 hours, as the Rebbe once said, he's spending time with his family, and even if he wants to, he can't go on the phone or on the computer or on the internet and so on. And it separates him from the world. It separates him from Goyim. Our president has a daughter who is a Giyedis, and I saw someplace that one of her acquaintances, or maybe even a relative, said that since she started keeping Shabbos, she's a better person. But a better person, Begashmias, she's wiser, she's sharper, and so on, because this is the Kayach of Shabbos. The day of rest of Shabbos is transforming. It's a whole different thing, a whole different mitzias. A Yid who keeps Shabbos. And Shabbos is an ois. It's an ois. It's a covenant. It's a sign between Yidden and the Eibishter of our very, very special bond. In Siddur it is written, "V'leinesati ad Hashem Elokeinu l'gei ha'aratzis, v'leinchalta ad Hashem Elokeinu le'evdei elilim, v'gam b'menuchosai la'yishkenu areilim k'li Yisrael amcha nasata b'yava l'zera yankev asher bom b'chorta." Every Shabbos, in Shacharis, we say 3 paragraphs, right? The first paragraph is Yismach Moshe, the second paragraph is V'shamru, and the third paragraph is V'leinesati. And V'leinesati means Shabbos is a mitzvah which is only for Yid and not for Goyim. And I'm not an expert on the Sheva mitzvahs, B'neneach, and all of the rest. A Goy is allowed to keep mitzvahs. He's not allowed to keep Shabbos. Goy sheshav is chayev misa. But apparently, it depends why the Goy is keeping Shabbos. If a Goy is keeping Shabbos in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a Goy is allowed to keep Shabbos as well. I'm not familiar with this completely, but I actually went online and I read some essays from Rabbonim. It depends why the Goy is keeping Shabbos. If the Goy is keeping Shabbos, al Shabbos, he's not allowed. But he's keeping Shabbos as a servant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as a prospective Gate, and so on, he's allowed to keep Shabbos. It's a different thing. But again, I don't want to go into this. This is not my department. It's not my strength. But Shabbos is uniquely Jewish. Shabbos is a gift from the Eibishter to the Jewish people, and we say in the Siddur, "V'leinesati ad Hashem Elokeinu l'gei ha'aratzos." It's not a Goy, it's only a Yid. A Goy could put up a mezuzah, a Goy could keep kosher, a Goy can't keep Shabbos. Shabbos is a matana to the Eibishter gave the Jewish people, because the Eibishter rested and Yidden rest. And of course, all of us appreciate, at least I hope all of us appreciate, that Shabbos is not one big negative. Shabbos is not one big, I can't do this, and I can't do that, and I can't do the other thing. Verkehrt. If Shabbos was all about don't do this, and don't do that, and don't do the other thing, you can ask this question: how is it that keeping Shabbos has preserved so many Yidden? And how, if a person keeps Shabbos, they're really de facto from a Yid. If the whole Shabbos is don't do, I'm stuck, I can't do, why is Shabbos so effective? Why is Shabbos so magical? And why is Shabbos so powerful? And of course the answer is because on Shabbos you're not doing nothing. You're doing rest. And rest is a very, very serious part of work. It makes sense even psychologically. That when a person works very hard and they stop and have opportunity to examine what they've done and to get pleasure from what they've achieved, which is going to motivate the work they're going to do the subsequent week or the subsequent day, that rest, that pleasure is incredibly useful in motivating the continuing efforts and work and success of that person. So Shabbos we don't do nothing. Shabbos we make Kiddush technically. But the union of Shabbos is menucha. Menucha doesn't mean doing nothing. Menucha means you're raising yourself above work to a level of delight and a level of pleasure, like it's explained in Chassidus. And on Shabbos, every Yid is in a holy place. And the holy place a Yid finds himself on Shabbos, and I mean this very conventionally, I don't mean this esoterically and mystically, very practically. You're in a holy place, and the Yid experiences the holiness on Shabbos, on one level or another, even if they're very simple. And that's the interruption of the life of the Yid from the week before, and inspiration of the Yid for the week that follows. In other words, Shabbos is magic. It really is. Shabbos is it's a day like any other, in terms of time, in terms of chronology. But the value of Shabbos and the impact of Shabbos and the reality of experiencing Shabbos is immeasurable. So having said what I've said so far about Shabbos, let's move on to our Maamar. Our Maamar begins with the pasuk. You can look on line 3, as it turns out, as Shabsoisai Tismoiru umiktashi tira'u v'goymer. The Yid has to keep Shabbos. Now in Hebrew, as Shabsoisai is Lashon Rabim. As Shabsoisai means my Shabboses in plural. My many Shabboses. My Shabboses you should guard. My Shabboses you should keep. So the question, of course, is why did it say Shabbos in plural? So you could answer it says Shabbos in plural because many different Jews keep Shabbos. You keep Shabbos. I keep Shabbos. He keeps Shabbos. She keeps Shabbos. As Shabsoisai means Shabbos as it applies to each Yid. Alternatively, you could say, as Shabsoisai Tismoiru means that every 7 days there's another Shabbos. Then you have 6 more days, and then again a Shabbos, and 6 more days, and weiter a Shabbos, and so forth. So the Torah says that Shabsoisai Tismoiru, you have to keep each and every Shabbos. But the Gemara translates as Shabsoisai Tismoiru in a very different way. The Gemara translates as Shabsoisai Tismoiru. Look in line 4. Hine pirush Shabsoisai im shtei Shabboses. Shabsoisai is in plural. My Shabboses. And the Chazal say a klal miyut rabim shnayim or shtayim. Whenever you say something in plural, Lashon of Torah, Lashon Mishnah, Lashon Chazal, it's at least twice. As Shabsoisai Tismoiru means you should guard my 2 Shabboses. The minimum number, miyut rabim, the minimum number that can be represented by a plurality is 2. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Mishum Shem Yecha, Yilmoli Misham and Yisrael Shtei Shabboses. Ki El Chasan, if Jewish people would keep 2 Shabboses as the requirement is, Meyadei Negon, they're going to be redeemed immediately. So there's a Gemara that translates as Shabsoisai Tismoiru as being the idea that I mentioned in the beginning about Shabbos across America, Shabbos across the world, that it says in Gemara that if Yidden would keep 2 Shabbos, Mashiach would come. And the source is this pasuk, as Shabsoisai Lashon Rabim Tismoiru. The problem is this. If you look on line 10, it says, V'zeu she'b'Yerushalmi omru ilu hoyu Yisrael mishamrim Shabbos echad ketikuna. If the Jewish people would keep 1 Shabbos as they should, miyad ha'ibn David Mashiach would come. So the question becomes, who do you follow, the Bavli or the Yerushalmi? The Bavli says you have to keep 2 Shabbos to bring Mashiach. The Yerushalmi says you have to keep 1 Shabbos to bring Mashiach. So who's right? And again, I don't know the answers al pi nigle. And by the way, this question is obviously discussed in this Maamar, but it's also discussed by Riches Gedel in the second chelik of Hebsh Chaim Beis with my mother of Tafresh Ayin Hey, where the Rebbe Rashab has a lengthy dissertation on Shabbos for many, many Maimurim, after Shabsoisai Tismoiru. And one of the aspects of that Shmuas is this question of whether you follow the Yerushalmi, that if Yidden would keep one Shabbos, Mashiach would come. Or the Bavli, if Yidden kept two Shabbos, Mashiach would come. And the Maimer over there is much longer than this Maimer, explains an explanation which is similar to the one we have here. How does Chassidus resolve this contradiction? How does Chassidus address the question of whether you follow the Yerushalmi that says one Shabbos, or the Bavli that says two Shabbos? By saying that it's Mara Merchode or Mara Merchode v'lei Pligi. There's no contradiction. B'chlal in general, halacha needs to resolve who's right and who's wrong because you have to know what to do. But anything which is not halacha l'maisa, practical halacha, and anything which is the chelik hadrush, v'hamusar, v'achsidis, and avodas Hashem, you don't have to pick a right and a wrong. They could both be right. And in this case, Chassidus explains it in a way that could even be understood al pi nigle. That the emes is if Yidden would keep one Shabbos, Mashiach would come, like it says in Yerushalmi. Why does it say in Bavli, at Shabsoisai Tismoiru, that you didn't have to keep two Shabboses? And the answer in one word is because every Shabbos has within itself two Shabboses. Look on line 5, at the very end of the line. V'hainu, this means Beis Bechinas Shabbos. The two aspects of Shabbos, Sheyesh B'chol Shabbos, which exist in each Shabbos, like it says in the Pasuk, El Shabbos B'Shabbat. On every Shabbos there's a second Shabbos. V'hainu k'meishkoso b'Zohar, and the language of the Zohar, Shet Shabbos Tato, V'Shabbos Ilah B'chol Shabbos. There's a lower Shabbos and a higher Shabbos in every single Shabbos. V'alzeh Nemar, and on these two Shabboses within each Shabbos, it's written as Shabsoisai Tismoiru, and then on line 10 the Rebbe brings the Yerushalmi that I said earlier. So if you read line 12, the Rebbe finishes. The Einei Seiser, there's no contradiction between the Yerushalmi that says Mashiach comes if Yidden keep one Shabbos, to the Bavli, where it says in the Maimer El Molim Mishaman Yisrael Shtei Shabbos. If Yidden would keep two Shabbos, Mashiach would come. And the answer is Kipidu Shtei Shabbos. The level, the idea of two Shabbos is Al Pi Chassidus, Hainu Gamkin Shabbos Achas. It's the two levels within one Shabbos. Al Derech HaNiska, like we've said before. So instead of deciding that the Bavli and the Yerushalmi have an argument, and then you have to figure out Eilu Vel Divrei Elokim Chai, but halacha kemi, like whom the halacha is, it becomes two compatible Yerushalmis, Gemaras. It's two Shabbos within each Shabbos. So this is what this Maamar is about. This Maamar is about the idea that every Shabbos has two Shabbos, and the idea that if you keep Shabbos, Mashiach comes, that if you keep Shabbos on both Madregas. I'm going to be honest with you. The next handful of lines, till line 30, is going to deal with Shabbos. And then we're going to leave Shabbos, and we're not going to come back to Shabbos until much, much later in the Maamar. On line 350 be'erach. So the Rebbe goes off on this huge, huge tangent for most of the Maamar. The whole Maamar is 500 lines, and almost 350 of the lines talk about Mamale and Seviv and Ha'ara and Etzem, all kinds of stuff, Malachim. And the Shabbos are discussed. He comes back to Shabbos much, much later. But this is the Nakud of the Maamar. The Nakud of this Maamar is to understand this idea of what's called in Chassidus Shtei Shabbos Shel Shabbos. How in each Shabbos, there's two Shabbos. So I am now going to explain. I'm going to give you now an introduction, or a second introduction, if you will. And I think over the years of our learning, we're learning now for 6 or 7 years, we have had more than one opportunity to share this, but this is an appropriate time and place to share it again, so we're going to share it. It says in Chassidus, and it's based on Kabbalah, and it's based on Zeir, and based on Kisvei Arizal, and so on, that in every Shabbos there's 3 madregas, 3 levels. There's what's called Maila Shabbata, which is the evening of Shabbos. There's what's called Yema Shabbata, which is the morning of Shabbos. And then there's Raiva Deraiva, there's the will of all wills, Mitzcha Datika Kadisha, which is Shabbos to Mincha, Shalosh Shudas. By Yom Tov, you don't say 3, you say maximum 2. On Yom Tov, there's only 2 Sudas. And on Shabbos, there's 3 Madregas. There's the Friday night, there's the Shabbos morning, and the Shabbos afternoon. Now, our Maamar is going to speak only about the first 2. Friday night and Shabbos morning. Is not going to go into Raiva Deraiva and Shalosh Shudas. And as I said to you before, the Hemshech Chaim Beis, the Rebbe Rashab, who discusses at length the union of Shabbos after the Shuas in Ayin Hey. And he also mentions this Bavli and the Yerushalmi that I just referenced, does talk about the 3 meals of Shabbos and explains them in a mamish and a delicious and a brilliant and a wonderful way. And as the expression in Yeshivish is Ayin Sham, go check it out yourself. It's a big idea, you can find it according to the Mafteach in Yonim, in the index. But our Maamar speaks about two madregas of Shabbos. So what I want to do before we begin is explain to you the meaning of the two levels of Shabbos, the way it's explained in so many Maamar Chassidus. And our Maamar is also going to explain the two levels of Shabbos in the language of this Maamar, and it will actually be perhaps a little bit different, or at least the form is going to be slightly different than the traditional form of the two ideas of Shabbos. So what are the two concepts of Shabbos that Chassidus talks about so much? And again, Raiva Deraiva, the third Madrega of Shabbos, we're leaving for a different time. It's much more subtle. And it's explained very, very simply. Friday night is called Maile Shabbat, the ascent of Shabbos. And Shabbos morning is called Yom Shabbat, the day of Shabbos, the morning of Shabbos, the revelation of Shabbos, the light of Shabbos. The concept is al derech mashal. Understand it in practical terms. If a person has an idea that he wants to do something, and the classic mashal that Chassidus always brings is he wants to build himself a home. Building a home is a flash, it's an idea that you want to have a home, and then of course that idea needs to be developed into where you're going to build that home. And which way is the home going to face? East, west, north, south. How much land are you going to have? How many rooms you're going to have? What the rooms are going to look like? What you're going to put in the rooms, and so on. So there are many, many, many steps from the initial inspiration to build a home to the actual creation of the home and the final analysis at the end of the day. And of course, we know the principle of Nas, Chilasan B'Seifon, and Seif Maiseh B'Machashava Techila, which is that your initial inspiration, the first thought, the first envisaging of that home, the first step in planning that home at the very, very beginning of that process is not realized, is not matured until the home is completely finished. Because the purpose of the home is to live in it and not to build it. And you can't live in it until it's completed. So the very, very first thing you contemplate manifests in the actual creation of the home at last, in reality. But of course, to build a house takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of creativity, it takes a lot of land. There's many takes a lot of. And as a consequence, it's a long story. It doesn't happen in a minute. And in doing it, you have to break up the task that you've undertaken to do into so many parts so that you can do one thing at a time. And any time a person is involved in a complex project, in an undertaking that's involved, that's long, it's exhausting. It's exhausting financially, it's exhausting physically, it's exhausting emotionally. But you persevere, you push through, you constantly remind yourself of what you've undertaken, and you keep driving yourself forward to go from point A to point B, to go from the beginning to the middle to the end. And one of the things that a person would do in order to motivate the continuing of the project and to measure and to test the place that you're in this great effort, in this great project, and so on, is to stop, to pause. Because when a person works, they have no time to fully pay attention to the work they're doing. When a person works, the person is certainly not in any position to enjoy and to delight into the work that he's doing and that he's done. Because you're working. And when you stop, even though you're stopping in the middle, so of course the word for stop is shvisa, Shabbos, the word for stop is menucha, is rest. And there is an understanding, and it's a quite logical understanding, that when you stop and you rest from work, you're able to objectively observe what you've achieved. You can examine what you've done, you can delight in the achievement, you can also critically examine what's been achieved, and if you feel or think that something should be modified or enhanced or changed in some way, you are in a better position to make those adaptations when you pause and when you stop. But ostensibly what happens when you stop in the middle of a project is you get to enjoy what you've already accomplished. And the pleasure of what you've already accomplished is the motivation for the continuation of the effort. This is the concept of Maile Shabbat, the Friday night, the ascent of Shabbos from the weekday. A whole week, the neshama is out in the world, in Elam Achitzen, and of course the real world is not just to survive as a Jew, but like it says in Chumash and in Mechilta the Rashbi that the Rebbe always brings, Sheishes Yamim Tasem Alachtecha, is a chayva, is a mitzvah, that just like it's a mitzvah to rest on Shabbos, it's a mitzvah to work during the week, because a whole week, the past noket, the namitas malachas of Shabbos is b'mishkan chshivi, what's important in Mishkan, which means in making a direle yisbarach b'tachteinim. This is what's included in the lamitas malachas of Shabbos, and a whole week you work. And you're serving the Eibishter in this work. But while you're working and serving the Eibishter, first of all, you're involved in a mulchama. Elam Haza is a war. And second of all, you have no time to stop and examine what you're accomplishing. And then Shabbos comes, so you stop. You separate yourself from your work, so you're higher than the work. You allow yourself to examine your work and to enjoy what you've achieved. And this is incredibly helpful in moving forward. So Shabbos is called Aliyah. That's how Shabbos is understood. Yom Tov is called Hamshacha, to bring godliness into the world. Shabbos called Aliyah, to raise yourself out of the world. That's what Shabbos is. And there's an enormous amount of pleasure. There's an enormous amount of pleasure of distancing yourself from the malacha, from the work you've done all week, and experiencing the rest and the delight of your work when Shabbos comes. Now, parenthetically, tangentially, this is an aside. It says in the Yidishkeit Shabos, and of course it's discussed at length in many places in Chassidus, that there's two concepts of Aliyah. Like I said a moment before, Shabbos is Aliyah and Yom Tov is Hamshacha. The idea of Shabbos is that you raise yourself up, which is why the Ikar of Shabbos is Oineg, Tainug on Shabbos, because Tainug is a direction of Aliyah. You go up into the Neshama where Oineg exists. And on Yom Tov you bring the Eibishter into this world. This is why Yom Tov is all about Simcha, because Simcha is about Gilui. Yom Tov is bringing the Eibishter into this world. But there's another concept of Aliyah which is brought in Kabbalah, and that's the Aliyah of Rosh Hashanah, which is called in Kabbalah Dormita. Erev Rosh Hashanah, there's a phenomena, there's an event, there's an experience of Shina, of rest, of sleep, Lamayla, Kfayachal, that has to be rebuilt on Rosh Hashanah. We call Binyan HaMalchus. So it's explained in so many places in Chassidus, and as I mentioned before, this is really in Tanya originally, that on Rosh Hashanah there's an aliyah of Pnimiyas Eilumis, not of Chitzenius Eilumis. And on Shabbos there's aliyah of Pnimiyas Eilumis as well as Chitzenius Eilumis. And then the Maamarim go into a whole pilpul, and then they'll say there's aliyah of Pnimiyas Eilumis and the Pnimiyas of Chitzenius Eilumis. The Chitzenius of the Chitzenius Eilumis does not have an aliyah, which is why not every Yid is zeicha to experience the aliyah of Shabbos, even though the aliyah is actually taking place. So Rosh Hashanah, the Pnimiyas goes away from the Chitzenius, which is not good. And you have to create it anew through Binyan HaMalchus. Shabbos, the Chitzenius goes up with the Pnimiyus, which is good, which is why we say on Shabbos that even Dvarim Gashmim are Oineg, Shine B'Shabbos Taineg, etc., etc., etc. The Rabbi brings Maamar Chazal on the Pasuk, V'lei Peresh Shabbatchem, Shabbos is no waste, everything is holy, because the word is in an uplifted and in a holy place. This is going away from work and experiencing the pleasure from the work. And keep in mind again that the work of a Yid B'Klal is Avedas Hashem, it's Avedas Abirurim. Shabbos, Beidir Asa, but a whole week it's a mitzvah. Lamatas Malachas of Shabbos. This is the concept of Friday night. Then comes Shabbos morning. On Friday night you already rested. And because you rested on Friday night and you paused, you experienced the pleasure of the work you've done, and you're motivated to continuing the effort now that you're able to examine and to see the success of the work, and you're experiencing it in the form of Oineg. So what happens Shabbos morning? You cannot say that on Shabbos morning you're going to have Oineg from Shvisam and Melacha, which means that Shabbos morning you're also going to have pleasure from stopping to work, because that pleasure you already had Friday night. And since you already had that pleasure Friday night, you can't say that Shabbos morning is the same pleasure again. It's not two madrigas, it's one and the same thing. So on Friday night, you stop working, and as you stop working, you're able to take in the pleasure, the oineg and the menucha and so on, from the work that you've done. Shabbos morning has a different kind of pleasure. And there may be more than one way of explaining these two different kinds of pleasures, but this is how I'm going to explain it to you. This is one of the many ways, or one of the several ways, that's explained in Chassidus. And that is as follows. Any time, any person undertakes to do anything involved, which is hard, And naturally, if it's involved and it's hard, it's motivated from inside of yourself, right? In the Lashon Chassidus, the highest level of the neshama is called oineg, and everything you do comes from oineg. And then when you carry it through into actuality, you go away from that oineg into the practical world of seichel and midas and the vushim and chushim to see it through. Anytime you undertake to do something complex that's hard, and you see it through much effort and much time and so on and so forth, there are two pleasures involved, at least two pleasures involved. The first pleasure is the pleasure of what you're doing. Like if a person is designing and building himself a home, the home he's going to design is a home that's going to give him pleasure. It's going to give him pleasure in the fact that he's building the home, but it's going to give him pleasure in the way he builds the home. The home is going to reflect his character, his personality, his tendencies, his geschmack is going to be invested in this home. And as a rule, anytime people do something, anything, especially if it's meaningful or for a meaningful purpose, there is delight in the work itself. The way they do the work gives them great pleasure. But while you're working, you don't have the time to experience the pleasure because you're preoccupied. When you stop working, there's the pleasure of what you've achieved. Your idea of what a home is supposed to look like, your idea of how to build a business, your idea of how to undertake any project is being born out in this effort, and there's an incredible pleasure from the specific design or the specific form that this project is taking on because it reflects you. That's a pleasure that's connected to what you're doing. But then there's a second pleasure. And the second pleasure is best represented by the Lashon from Chazal, which Rashi brings, Lagabi Karbanas. Nachas ruach lafonei sha'amarti v'nasa retzeni. There is the simple pleasure that you had an idea and it's happening, period. And that's a very, very different pleasure from the first pleasure. Why? Because if you're building a house and you get pleasure for building the house, it's about the house. The pleasure from the house is completely separate from the pleasure, say, of music or of a good smell or of another project you're involved with. Because the pleasure of the home is limited to this particular home. On the other hand, when you say you have pleasure because you had an idea and what you were thinking to do is being done and you see that it's realistic for it to be carried through and it's going from point A to point B to point C to point D and so on, and you see that what you wanted is happening, there's a very different kind of pleasure in that. There's the pleasure of what you're doing, and there's a pleasure that you did it. There's a pleasure connected to the specific project and the specific undertaking that you're involved with, and there's the pleasure from the fact that something you wanted to achieve is being achieved. And to use other, more fancy Chassidic terminology, the first is called the Einig HaMurkav, and the second is called Einig HaPasha. There is the pleasure you have from building this house is a complex pleasure. It's pleasure which is reichev and qualified and compounded by this particular endeavor. But when you have pleasure from the fact that you wanted to do something and what you wanted is being achieved, that's a tainig aposha. It's a simple pleasure because that pleasure is not about the house, it's not about the music, it's not about the art, it's not about the smell, taste, taste, and so on. It's about you. And this is how Chassidus explains the difference between Friday night and Shabbos morning. On Friday night, a Yid rests, a Yid is Sheves Memloch. And when a Yid rests, there's the pleasure from the work he did during the preceding week. Shabbos morning comes, it's not about resting from work. He's done with that. Shabbos morning comes, he's enjoying the fact that he's done something. What he's done doesn't matter. The fact that he did it. And this is a very simple explanation for the difference between the Shtei Shabbos Shel Shabbos, the Shabbos of Friday night, which is called Maile Shabbata, and the Friday, the Tainig of Shabbos day, which is called Yom Shabbat. Now, of course, I hope everybody understands that when you learn about Shabbos in Pnimius HaTeira, in Kabbalah and Chassidus, the Ikir of Shabbos is not your pleasure. The Ikir of Shabbos is the pleasure that happens Lamaila. In other words, on Shabbos there is an event which is called Aliyas Eilemes. The worlds ascend, the worlds rise up, and technically you would use this language. They rise up from the Madrega of Dibur to the Madrega of Machshava. A whole week Hashem creates the world through speech, and on Shabbos Hashem stops speaking, and He continues to create the world through thought. V'haraya, the world does not disappear, but it's a very different world that the Eibusha creates through thought as opposed to through speech, and the Rebbe brings in Tanya Negers Lakedish and Kuntesachrin. This is the reason for B'mtzei Cheftzach Avadaber Dover, that there's a Bikushi Tiru Daber Dividitere B'Shabbos. There's an argument that you should not be able to speak at all on Shabbos, because just as the Eibishter creates the world the whole week through speech, and on Shabbos he stops to speak, and he only creates the world through thought, a Yid should be shavis like that. Not only should stop doing Malacha, which is an Asiyah, he should stop speaking, which is a Dibur. And Al-Rebbe has a whole arichas that on Shabbos, Shalei Dehei Dibur Chach B'Shabbos, Ke Dibur Chach B'Chel, you have to have Pnimius HaShabbos, which is the idea of Vayivarach Vayikadosh. You have to be busy only with Kedusha, holy things on Shabbos. But the Ikir of Shabbos is that Lamayla there's an Aliyah. In other words, not only we're having pleasure, but Vayachal there's a pleasure of the Eibishter. What is the nature of this pleasure? That the worlds are raised up to a madrega of Ein Seif. The worlds are raised up to a level where they're a working world, a dibur world, to a level of Ein Seif, to a level of thought, to a level of ruchnias. And in that environment, there's peace. In that environment, there's no need to correct. There's no need for malacha. You're not allowed to have malacha. It's peaceful and whole. And this is the Eibishter's pleasure, so to speak. The Einig of the Eibishter. And there's the Aliyah Friday night. There's the Aliyah of Shabbos day, and there's the Aliyah of Raiva Deraiv, which is discussed, like I said earlier, in the three Madregas, Nemshech Hayim Beis, that I referenced. So there's the Ruchni the Shabbos. On Shabbos, all the worlds were on a higher Madreg. And the higher Madrege, the worlds are included in Ein Seif. That happens on Shabbos. There's the Friday night, and there's the Shabbos day. So now, of course, comes the mandatory stories, and I remember telling these stories to this very audience on another occasion when we had a discussion on Shabbos, that the Rebbe continued the minig of eating by his shviger, by the previous Rebbe's Rebbetzin, on Yomam Tevim, that means Pesach and Shavuos and Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and I think also Matzah Yom Kippur, as had been the minig b'chaim Yossi B'al Modein of the Liadi Rebbe. And the Rebbe sat in the same place he stood b'chaim of the Liadi Rebbe, not at the head of the table, but to the left. And there was a minyan of Chassidim that were invitees that were sitting around, and the Bacham used to come in, and so on. The Rebbe, as a rule, did not initiate conversation. The Rebbe sat there. Again, I was never there, but there's some photos that were recently publicized also. The Rebbe sat there as if the Frierdiker Rebbe was sitting physically next to him. But if you would ask him a question, he would answer. So somebody once asked the Rebbe a question. It must have been on Pesach. That it says in the previous Rebbe Siches that the happiest day of the year, the freilichste day of the year, by Rabbi Seinu Nesienu was Shvi'ah Shal Pesach. The happiest, the most joyous day of the year was Shvi'ah Shal Pesach. So he asks the Rebbe, what was this simcha? So the Rebbe answers him, Minei Obei. You ask me what the simcha was? You were there. You were by the Frierdiker Rebbe. So you must have seen it. So he tells the Rebbe, Minei Obei. That's exactly why I'm asking. I was there. I didn't see anything. So the Rebbe looks at him, and the Rebbe asks him a question. It says in Kabbalah that on Shabbos is Aliyah Se'elemis. All the worlds are raised up. And they're raised up into a level of delight and pleasure. Do you see that? You don't see that. So because you don't see it as it isn't happening, it's a chasarn in you, in the eyes. But on Shabbos is Aliyah Se'elemis. And the Rebbe, of course, concluded just like on Shabbos you don't see that the world is in a holier place than it is in the 6 days before and the 6 days after. You didn't see Shvi'ah Shal Pesach. There was an incredible inyan of Simcha. It's not that it wasn't there, you were not able to witness it. And there are kama sipurim of tzaddikim and of Rabbi Seinu Nesienu, where you see this idea that Shabbos is fundamentally different than the weekday, in the ruach, in the spirit, in the holiness, bepeil mamish. For example, they tell a story about Rabbi Leivik. I think I read it, but I certainly heard it, that there were Bachrim in Yekaterinslav, where Rabbi Leivik was the Rebbe's father. And one of the Bachrim was discussing with Rabbi Leivik this question of how you see that Shabbos is different during the week. Because on Shabbos is Aliyah Pnimi, Chitanias HaElemus also, not just Pnimius HaElemus. And then, of course, the city that the Rabbi Leivik was the Rav in was Yekaterinslav, which was later called the Neper Petrovskis on the Neper River. And the Rebbe Leivik was walking along the river, and he's walking with these Bachrim, and he leans over and he listens, and he says, Herst es chvalat sechandish. You hear? The waves are different on Shabbos than during the week. Now, what did Rabbi Leivik hear? They didn't hear it. But Rabbi Leivik wasn't a liar, and he wasn't being facetious and dramatic. If he said that on Shabbos chvalat sechandish, it's because he heard a difference. There was a different, Shabbos is different. He heard it physically. Maybe they didn't hear it, but he heard it. And then, of course, there's the classic story with the Ruzhiner, the Heilige Ruzhiner Rebbe, As a child, the Malamed taught them the Gemara, Shecheich Masei Shabbos. If you forget one Shabbos, says, what are you supposed to do? L'gabe Melocha and l'gabe Chilul Shabbos. Meni Yemechad and Shaveth Shisa, Shaveth Shisha, Meni Yemechad, and so on. And the Ruzhner raised his hand and said to the Malamed, how could you forget when Shabbos is? Now, the Ruzhner was brilliant. So brilliant, in fact, that he had a minig that every question that Rashi asks, he would ask his Malamed when he taught them the Pasuk. Every single question Rashi asks. So the Malamed couldn't understand why he doesn't understand. The person is Yetzi B'Shayara. You go out in a caravan. And in caravans you can have sandstorms. And the sandstorms can last for days. And you can lose track of time. So the Rishna told the Malamed that he doesn't understand. So the Malamed said to him in exasperation, Yisraelik, you're so bright. How come you don't understand? So the Rishna Rebbe said, Vale Shabbos is der Himmel an andere. On Shabbos, the sky looks different. News of the sky looks different. How could you not see Shabbos? Wherever you look in the world, you have a different sky on Shabbos. And then, of course, there's a Maisa also with the same Yerushin Rebbe when he was an adult. And Rabbi Isaac Homler was sent by the Tzemach Tzedek as the Shlichus to the Heilig Yerushin Rebbe. And Rabbi Isaac was a Litvisher Chassid, a Gon and Nigle and a Medayik and every Hanhoge, but also a very Chassidishe Yid. And he knew that although he was much older than the Yerushin is a Tzaddik Elyon, and he observed every Hanhoge, and he brought back to us, to Chabad, many stories of that one Shabbos, which have become part of Chabad lore. The previous Rebbe has it in letters. And one of the stories that he brought back was that it was Friday afternoon. And the Rishna was sitting, he was smoking a pipe. And the Misharis came in and he banged on the table with a little gavel and said Shabbos. So the Rabbi Isel was there and he was watching the Rishna Rebbe. And he said the pipe fell out of his mouth. He didn't spit it out, it fell out of his mouth. And he added, he says, I could see clearly, physically. He went to another place, we stayed where we were. Rabbi Isli used to say, I don't understand spirituality. I don't know spirituality, but I understand it. He was able to sense that on Shabbos, the Rishon was in a different place. So by tzaddikim, aliyas, ha'ilim, on Shabbos is an actual thing. And there's a very big difference between Friday night and Shabbos morning. On Friday night, the world is raised up to have pleasure from the avodah that was done all week. And on Shabbos morning, there's a different pleasure. The pleasure from having served the Eibishter. Not the specific avodah you did all week, from the fact that we served the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And tangentially, I might as well mention this also, since I'm talking so much about Shabbos. This is the explanation for what happens on Friday night. We say, Heidel Hashem Kitei Kilielam Chaste. Yedel Avaya Chaste V'nifleis of the other. We say before Minche. Mizmel Seidah, thanking Hashem for Yedei Yom Sha'olu and Hilchim Midbaris, for surviving all kinds of difficulties, going through a desert and crossing the sea and coming out of prison and recovering from an illness. Why every Friday do you say this? Because you're thanking Hashem for surviving the reality of the world. You're coming home. So when it comes Shabbos and you go away from the weekday, you're coming home, so you celebrate. And perhaps this is why in Shabbos Chalameid it's not said because you didn't work before Shabbos. And this, of course, is also the reason for Eishes Chayil. Friday night, before Kiddush, we say Eishes Chayil. Eishes Chayil. I have a class, by the way, on my website on Eishes Chayil. There are 2 classes, you can check them out. Inside Chassidus.org, in my Tefillah section and in my Shabbos section. I don't really have a Shabbos section, in my Tefillah section. I have several classes on Eishes Chayil. And the Nekuda is, Eishes Chayil goes on the Neshama. And this Neshama is a resourceful business lady who's a manufacturer and a producer and a trader and a merchant, and she buys and she sells and she produces. And of course, the oddest thing about Eishes Chayil is that everything that she does is for her husband, because her husband is the Eibishter. And she works at night, she works on difficult conditions, she produces things, she prepares things, she sells things, she profits, and everything she brings to her husband. This is going on in the Neshama. And on Friday night, you're seeing Eishes Chayil, you're celebrating the Neshama's survival of another week in Elam Hazeh, and you're celebrating its return. This is not just a practical thing, it's very much a mystical thing. Because on Shabbos there's Aliyas Elam. So our Maamar is about Shtei Shabbos Shel Shabbos, the 2 levels of Shabbos. And like I told you before, we're going to revisit this like in line 350, I think. It's going to be a long time after tonight, 349, 350, when we're going to go back to Shabbos, and Mitzvah Hashem will get to it. But this class is the introductory class about Shabbos, and we'll go off on a number of tangents about the principle of Yerida Tzerech Aliyah to explain Shabbos, and then we'll come back to Shabbos. But in the meantime, we're talking about Shabbos. So let's go to the text. again, and read line 15. We must understand why the Gemara Yerushalmi says if you didn't keep one Shabbos, and the Gemara Bavli says if you didn't keep two Shabbos, Mashiach will come. And the explanation is because it's Shtei Shabsoisai Shel Shabbos. The two Shabbos is when each Shabbos, and the way I explained it to you, it's Friday night and Shabbos day. Says the Rebbe, what does this mean? Says the Rebbe, Tzarech Lovin in Shabbos. Before you start talking about two Shabbos, let's explain Shabbos once. One Shabbos. And we'll get to two Shabbos later on. It is known the Shabbos of Bechinas Aliyas Elamis. On Shabbos, the worlds have an ascent. Just like we stop working, the Eibishter stops speaking. And even though the Eibishter stops to speak, the worlds don't disappear because he continues to speak on a Madrega of Machshav. And it's not just that the world at large has an aliyah on Shabbos, but everything a Yid does, everything that a human being did in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which includes making a living, which is also Avodas Hashem. It's serious Avodas Hashem. Haneg B'minig Derech Eretz has an aliyah on Shabbos. So Shabbos, everybody comes home. That's the celebration of Yedel Hashem Chazdei, V'nifleisav of the Adam, and that's the celebration of Eishes Chayil. And by the way, you can explain L'chun Rana the same way. It says in Sfarim, L'chun Rana was introduced to truth by the Parshas by the Arizal, that you have 7 paragraphs that correspond to the 7 days of the week. And L'chun Rana is also in Yifan Aliyah. Says the Rebbe on line 18, V'amna. But it's not so simple. Because you cannot say that the weekday work becomes a Lakus. Leisha miskalalim b'Shabbos mamish. It's not that the work you did during the week becomes Shabbazik. Why? It's impossible for the substance of weekday type of work shatuchlo b'Shabbos to become part of Shabbos because they're so far apart. Now, I don't know exactly what this means, and because I don't know, I can't explain. But let's continue. Ella, the teretz is, if what you do during the week and we do on Shabbos are so far apart that they cannot be elevated on Shabbos, so then what's the point of the whole Shabbos? And the answer is as follows. Every day there's a trace of Shabbos. And this, of course, has to be done every day. And where do you have Shabbos on a Sunday and on a Monday and on a Tuesday and a Wednesday and a Thursday and a Friday? V'huat tefillah. But in Yidavins, that's the Shabbos of his everyday. Because Shabbat nechlala ve'elim ateiru ma'asim tevim shel kol hayom. Every tefillah, you're stopping your life, and of course this is most exceptional in Tefillas HaMincha, as it says in Chassidishe and in Sfarim. And what you do is elevated in your davening of that day. Ki atfillah nikras eilas tamid. The tefillah is also going to give ascent eilas tamid. Al shem aliyah se'elameis, based on the same principle of the world's being raised up. She'elim lamayla is manat tefillah. But this is not something which happens once a week. It happens 3 times a day. There's something called vani tefillah se'lechad Hashem eis ratzon. There's the correct time for davening. And when a Yid davens, the time he's supposed to, which is an eis ratzon, there's an aliyah every day. That K'mei Shabbos Nikir Eilos Shabbos, just like Shabbos itself, is the ascent Al Shem Aliyah Se'elam Shabbos. The same is true. Every tefillah is even Eilos Tamid. Says the Rebbe on line 25. And then, because the work was supplemented by the davening, and the davening is Shabbosdik, the davening has an aliyah. The weekday prayers, and all the good deeds, and the Torah and mitzvahs and tefillah, which are included in that tefillah during the week, they become elevated into Shabbos mamish. So it's like 2 steps. The work you do during the week is included in the davening you're doing during the week, and the davening, the way you daven during the week, is included in Shabbos davening, and that's the aliyah of everything you do during the week. Line 27. Says the Rabbi, I don't understand. Inyan aliyas elu mahu. What does it mean on Shabbos there's an aliyah? What does it mean during the week there's a yerida? None of this makes any sense. Why? Ein eid milvade. The world is filled with the glory of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Uksiv, and it's written, Kedeshem, Ulikim b'shamayim, Ma'avaras mitachas. The Eibush is everywhere in the same way. And it also says in Zeh Leisasar Ponim, and there's a place where the Eibush is not. So he brings 3 rayas. Molech alaretz kevedi, the Shem hu Ulikim, and Leisasar Ponim inei. The Eibush is everywhere. If the Eibush is everywhere, why do you have to raise anything up one level to another? Wherever it is, it's one with the Eibush. The question is, Mahu Loshan Aliyah Se'elamis. What do you mean the worlds are being elevated from one place to another, from one station to the next? Wherever they are, they're Atzmas Samhus. The question also applies to the pasuk Eilas Shabbos. The mashmash Eilam Lamayla Dafka. The word Eilas Shabbos connotes that on Shabbos there's an aliyah, and the question becomes, how can there be an aliyah on Shabbos if everything always is one without amhos ein safe baruch. So tonight we learned a small piece of Maamar. We did a lot of discussing about Shabbos, and Shabbos is going to be put on the shelf. Next week we're going to be discussing Neshamas and Malachim. Really, the next 75 pages are going to be discussing Neshamas and Malachim. And after we discuss Neshamas and Malachim, we're going to begin a conversation about the principle of why you have to have Yeridat Tzerech Aliyah. What's wrong with the Neshama in Gan Eden? Why must he descend in order to ascend, and so on and so forth. And with Hashem's help, we'll eventually get back to discussing Shabbos also.